Welcome to this Electrical Engineering Departmental Colloquium. My name is Daniel Kirsch, and I have the great pleasure today of introducing my friend Ben Hobbs. Ben got his PhD in Environmental Systems Engineering from Cornell University, and he's currently the Theodore N.K. Shad Chair of Environmental Management at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, where he works in the Department of Geography and Environmental Engineering. Ben has worked at Brookhaven Oak Ridge National Laboratory and was on the faculty at the Case Western Reserve University. Ben's research and teaching work is in the area of application systems analysis and economics to electric utility regulation, planning, and operation. And he's one of those people who can safely mix electricity and water. So he also works on water resources systems. Ben, in addition to his academic activities, is also the chair of the Market Surveillance Committee of the California Independent System Operators, so he knows how things actually work in practice, not just in theory. And finally, Ben is a fellow of the IEEE and informs. Ben, thank you very much.
Daniel. I get to make give a seminar in this department once every 10 years, and it's just amazing to see the progress that's made here. I was on sabbatical in civil engineering across the street 20-something years ago, when you were in this old building and there were like 5 students, of which maybe 1 was awake, when I gave a seminar about markets and electricity, which was a really bizarre notion in 1992. And now look at this. Congratulations on the new building. Congratulations on what's happened to this department in terms of the rankings and the people who've come, and especially on you being able to attract the top power systems researcher from the European Union to come here in the form of Daniel. So let's see, I'm going to talk about optimization and why it's really enjoyable to apply it to electricity, in a particular electricity market modeling. So I'm going to give a couple of examples. A simple example that shows the sort of insights you can get from a small model you solve quickly, that you can then use the model and its insights in a policy debate and affect the outcome of that debate. And then, well, sometimes you really need numbers. If you're going to build a transmission line, or you're going to decide which of 500 power plants are you going to turn on in the next 10 minutes, you don't need a simple model for insights. You need a complicated model for particular numbers. And I'll give an example of that type of model. Both models are optimization models, but used for very different purposes. So I'll talk about why power is fun and power modeling is fun. And of course, since you're in electrical engineering, you already know that power is fun. That's why you're here. And then I'll talk about simple models. The simple model concerns the question of who should be responsible for tracking and limiting carbon dioxide greenhouse gas emissions. That was a debate in California. And as a result of our model, the state of California avoided making a big mistake, in my opinion. And then the complex model deals with uncertainty. What transmission should we build in the next few years to best place ourselves for the wave of renewables that's going to be coming in the future, recognizing that there are profound economic, technical, and policy uncertainties. Okay, so why is the power sector fun? I can safely mix water and electricity, perhaps, but this young gentleman, I always show this slide to non-electrical engineers. You already know the answer. How can you tell the difference between AC power and DC power? So how can you tell from this young man? If it's DC, his teeth clench down. If it's AC, his teeth chatter. So power is so important because it's a huge part of the economy. Twice the size, for example, of the university sector, 10 times the size of the water sector, has huge environmental impacts. Most of our greenhouse gases, most of our sulfur dioxide and acid rain and other problems. But it could also be used to solve environmental problems if we have a lot more electric-based transportation and electric-based building, heating, and cooling. We could save a lot of emissions of greenhouse gases. The industry is always changing. In the 20 years since I last gave a seminar, well, the first seminar I ever gave here. We've gone through waves of restructuring. The industry is very different. And modeling is a way to figure out what might happen when you restructure the industry and figure out the impacts. And finally, there are dumb grids. We only have half a market at the present time. We have suppliers competing with each other to provide power, but the consumers do not participate in the market, in my opinion, meaningfully. You have no idea what the price of electricity is right now. You have no idea whether it's in great shortage or in great surplus, which means you can't really decide how you should manage your use. It's like you going to a grocery store and there are no prices on anything, and you buy a bunch of steak, and you find out at the end of the month that you bought steak at a time that it cost $200 a pound. You can't participate meaningfully in such a market. And finally, there are lots of surprises. So here's an example of some surprises. These are all projections of electricity use and energy use in the US economy from 1975, made in 75, guessing what would happen in the year 2000. The biggest forecast guessed that there would be a tripling of energy use, and others guessed they would be flat. So what do you think actually happened? Any guesses? So this is what actually happened. That was what was projected by Amory Lovins, and he got it right for the wrong reasons. But at any rate, what we thought would happen to nuclear power, to coal power, to natural gas, all these guesses back then were wrong. Back here, oh, I used the mouse. Back here, Jimmy Carter said, you shouldn't use natural gas in power plants. It's too valuable a fuel. It'll be all nukes and coal. But what actually happened is we used a lot of gas. Oh, and you've seen these sorts of predictions as well before. You know, all predictions are wrong, but some of them are useful. So here's something a little bit more recent. The common wisdom is that the power sector will continue to be dominated by coal, which is this upper line, which shows month to month between 2007 and 2009 how much power was generated by coal, how much was generated by natural gas, and then from other sources. And the Department of Energy projection said this will continue in the future. Coal will remain king. But what actually happened is that about a year ago, natural gas caught up to coal. Now, these have diverged once again, but nobody expected this to happen for decades, and yet it happened right away. This was because of fracking making natural gas really cheap. So lots of surprises on demand, lots of surprises in terms of supply, and everybody, before you laugh at, this is my very first journal article, before you laugh at how unrealistic this is, just think 30 years from now, I want you to be standing up and giving a seminar showing something from one of your first article and getting everybody to laugh at how unrealistic it was. So given that President Carter said we won't build any natural gas plants, and given that this utility in New Jersey already had 2 floating nuclear power plants on order and under construction, it seemed reasonable back then to project that, okay, we'd have a lot of coal plants in the west of the PJM region and a lot of nukes in the east. This was 1978, prior to 3 Mile Island. And at that time, electricity was growing 3.5% a year, doubling every 20 years. And that seemed like a realistic forecast. What actually happened? Do you think any of these power plants got built? Oh, I saw one head shake. That's correct. None of these got built. We had 3 Mile Island that killed off the nuclear industry in the US pretty much for new plants. It's only restarted after roughly 30 years. Those coal plants never got built. Instead, demand went up 1% rather than 3.5% per year, and we got cheap gas thanks to basically President Reagan's deregulation of the natural gas industry. So the industry looked entirely different than we thought it was going to look like in 1978. This is what keeps me coming back to the power industry. I thought, okay, I work in this industry for 10 years and then it'll be boring. It's never boring. There are always new things happening. More surprises. The International Energy Agency predicted that we'd have 3% of global energy from renewables by 2020. We reached that in 8 years. This is a good surprise, right? We're getting more than we thought. They also thought that we'd have 30 gigawatts of wind by 2010, and we actually had almost 10 times that amount. In the 1970s, the National Research Council, National Academy of Sciences, said wind is the least attractive of all renewable sources. And of course, it's the dominant one right now, aside from hydro. International Energy Agency said, oh, we might be lucky to have 2 gigawatts of wind in China. They had 20 times that. Again, this industry is fun because there are all sorts of surprises. There are all sorts of problems we need to deal with. Why is math fun? Why is energy modeling, electricity modeling fun? It's because the mathematics itself is beautiful. There are bigger problems than we'll ever be able to solve, so there are computational challenges. There's counterintuitive economic behavior. What you think is true and best is not. The models are always surprising you. It's easy to model, relatively, because there's lots of data available. And finally, of course, the problems are practically very important. If we mess up the power sector, we have blackouts and we hurt the economy. If you do it right, you get a more efficient and cleaner future. That's the hope anyway. So what do I mean by electric power models? Models that either simulate how the system performs over time or finds the best alternatives for controlling the system or designing the system in the long run. And we're talking about producing power, transporting it, and using it. We're talking about multiple objectives, not just cost and economics, but environmental and social objectives. And finally, we're either using math and perhaps computers. The simple models, you may not need computers at all to make a difference. And I'm going to focus on optimization models that have a lot of engineering detail. These are called bottom-up models that have both representations of, for example, individual transmission lines and generators, as well as human behavior. Both are really important in this system. Companies use them for strategy to figure out how to maximize the profits, and, in policy analysis, we use them in Washington and in Sacramento and elsewhere to try to project how the power system and market will respond to policy initiatives, such as if we cap greenhouse gases, what will happen to prices? What will happen to reliability? Who wins and who loses? Okay, so those of you who don't know about optimization models, engineering economic models, just a quick summary. You have decision variables, things you can yank around. You have objectives. What are you trying to accomplish? Minimize costs, maximize profit, minimize environmental damage. So that's going to guide the choice of values for the variables. And then finally, the constraints tell you what's possible and not possible. So you're going to try to choose the values of these that satisfy those constraints and give you the best possible value of those. So here's a simple example. The variable might be G, which is the megawatt output from power plant I in time period T. So if you have 24 hours and 100 power plants, you have 2,400 of these variables, each of which has a cost coefficient, and you sum it up over the 24 hours and the 500 plants to get the total cost. So maybe we're trying to minimize that. And the reason why we can't push cost to zero is because we have to, first of all, meet demand in every hour. So the sum of the G's in a particular hour has to equal the demand. And we have to respect the limits on how we can operate it. For example, some very simple limits might be that your generation is between 0 and the capacity, and the change from one period to the next in your generation is less than some upper ramp limit, and that should be, on the left, that should be negative here, is between some range. It's like my old Yugo car. You can't move it too fast. You can't accelerate and decelerate too fast. Economists are almost more interested in something called the dual variable Lagrangian to the constraints that tells you the marginal cost of meeting demand, and those are used as prices in markets. This is what people get paid. In long-run markets, you might also have capacity and demand be a variable also. You can install energy-efficient lighting. You can build new power plants, build wind turbines. So that's a design problem, but this problem is stated here as an operations problem. Okay, that's an example of optimization. When we do a market model, what I'm going to be doing is taking an optimization problem for each participant in the market, assuming that that represents how they make decisions. So generation company 1, generation company 2, and so forth. And then ask, is there an equilibrium where everybody is maximizing profit and nobody wants to change what they do? So this is a generalization of the optimization model that I showed you before. For company 1, Seattle City Light, for example, they decide on how to operate their reservoirs in the Skagit Valley. They decide what additional power plants or energy efficiency measures they invest in. And that's an optimization problem. And then another company, is it still Puget Power and Light? Puget Sound, or Pungent Sound? Anyway, they have their own problem, and they're optimizing. And so what you're asking is, do they each have a set of decisions such they, subject to the market prices, so they all believe they're maximizing their profit? You have models for consumers, and then finally what wraps it all together are market clearing constraints that say the supply has to equal demand, and that's what generates your prices. So the overall market model is actually a bunch of optimization problems, and you have market clearing constraints that make sure that the solutions are consistent. And the way that you practically solve these is that you take the Kuhn-Tucker conditions for each optimization problem, pile them up in the middle of the table from all the different parties, and then wrap a ribbon around that's market clearing and solve them all at once. Okay, no model is correct, but nevertheless, a model can still be useful. And there are 3 types of models I'll mention. There are small models that are useful in policy debates. For example, you might prove a general conclusion that this policy is never better than that policy, and I can show it QED. I don't need any numbers. I don't need to run the computer at all. Or you can show examples. When I run this for Seattle City Light, we see that consumers are better off if we have energy efficiency programs. So this shows that these programs can be beneficial. It's a proof by example. And in policy debates, the important thing is you need transparency. You need to be able to explain this in your elevator talk with the CEO when you're riding up in the elevator. In 3 minutes, why are these programs a good idea? What are the insights you get from the model? Sometimes, though, you need actual numbers. How are we going to operate the grid now? What lines to build? And so these are big, complicated models. And then finally, there are some in-between models that we use for policy analysis that have somewhat realistic detail. So we need to know that power prices are different in Washington State than in California, but we don't have every single bus in the WECC represented in this model. We want to be able to do lots of scenarios. Okay, so let's have some fun with models, and I'm going to talk about 2 different models quickly. And by fun, I mean you get conclusions from this that contradict what people thought was true. Okay. Some of you may recognize this as the first AC line in the United States. So if they stuck a fork in the socket, their teeth would be chattering. Some technologies haven't changed much, other technologies have. Okay, so the question here is, if you want to limit the CO2 emissions from the power system, where in the supply chain should you limit it? Should you make, for example, the fuel sources, oil and coal and so forth, keep track of their carbon and limit those? Or should you have power plants? Or this is what was proposed in California, that you have the folks who buy electricity keep track of whether they bought it from dirty sources or clean sources, and they would have to limit their total emissions from all those sources. If you buy some dirty stuff today, you need to buy clean stuff tomorrow. Different law proposals for laws are addressed at different places in the supply chain. And the question that I faced here was, should we do it like everybody else? In Europe and in the Northeast US, we have power plants count the emissions, and they have to limit their emissions. But in California, it was proposed that you have consumers or load-serving entities, the companies that directly sell to consumers, keep track of it. And the way I explain this proposal is as follows. Imagine that you're going to lunch and you go to the sidewalk vendor of hot dogs, and you want to buy a hot dog. You need 2 credit cards and not 1. One credit card is for money. Okay, a hot dog is $3, pay for that there. Okay, the other one is carbon. I have 5 tons of carbon on this card. If I buy a hot dog that's 8 pounds of carbon, maybe I shouldn't get the hot dog, maybe I should get the veggie burger, which is only 3 pounds of carbon. So everything has 2 prices, and as a consumer, you have to limit your purchases to how much carbon you have in your budget. Now, in my opinion, if you want to get the US public really mad at environmentalists, have a law like that. But this was what California wanted to do. And there are arguments in favor of it, right? We all have a moral responsibility to limit our carbon emissions, so this makes us conscious of those. Okay, so there's Governor Arnold, the Terminator, and he signed a law called AB 32, which had the goal of limiting California emissions to 1990 levels. And the main debate in implementing this law was the point of compliance. Should it be power plants, or should it be consumers or the companies that sell to consumers, as I explained. And these are the 2 options. Power plants count their emissions and limit them, or consumers or load-serving entities do. And throughout the world, elsewhere, it's power plants that count their emissions. And if you have a dirty power plant and their emissions exceed their cap, they have to buy allowances from somebody else. But in California, they can't do things like everybody else. They said, let's have the consumers be responsible because it might provide more motivation for installing energy efficiency measures like clean light bulbs, and it might also cost less. And this seemed to be headed in the direction of implementation. So, this is where the simple model comes in. Put together a simple model comparing these 2 systems, and we found out that both of those conclusions were wrong. There's not a stronger motivation for investing in energy efficiency. Consumers don't save any more money by doing that. And furthermore, it's not cheaper. Just because a consumer can decide to buy from an expensive wind turbine or cheap coal power plant doesn't mean their total power bill will go down. And we showed this with a simple model. And in the interest of time, I won't go through the equations, but I'll give you a sense of how we set this up. So first, you draw a schematic. Who are the players in the market? What are they buying and selling? So we have consumers who buy power from generators. And let's say they're 2 generation companies. Generators have to buy fuel, but they also have to buy emissions allowances. So if you have a dirty plant, you have to buy a lot of allowances from the CO2 market. But you also might give some allowances away free. So we have 2 markets, so we're going to have 2 prices. We'll have a CO2 price and we'll have power prices. Now, how do we actually represent that? What you have to do is you have to have an optimization problem. Consumers choose who they buy power from. That's A or DB. Do they buy it from power plant A or B? Each power plant decides how to operate their facility to maximize their profit. And basically, they're maximizing the revenue from power, price times sales, minus the cost for emissions and the cost of fuel, subject to their generation constraints. And finally, besides the optimization problems for each player, you have to have market clearing constraints that basically say supply, G, equals demand, D, plus the emissions from all power plants can't be more than the amount of allowances. So what's the equilibrium? What values of prices and quantities will you see such that everybody thinks they're maximizing their benefits and the market's clear? And the way you do that is, these are called Kuhn-Tucker conditions, and I won't go through this. It's basically the first order condition in calculus. Remember, when the slope is equal to 0, you're at a maximum if you satisfy the second order condition. You do that for each player, combine those first order conditions with market clearing. We'll have 10 variables and 10 conditions that we can then solve for the market equilibrium. So this equilibrium problem consists of the first order conditions for 3 optimization problems plus the market clearing conditions. So we did the same thing then for the other proposal. That was the proposal for emissions trading. Here's the proposal for consumers carrying around a carbon credit card. Consumers have to choose how much to consume, but the emissions associated with that consumption have to be less than some cap. So if I buy a dirty plant today, I buy a hot dog today, I have to buy from a clean plant tomorrow, or I have to buy a veggie burger tomorrow. That's the idea. And power plants sell power to different consumers. Clean plants will get a higher price than dirty plants. Okay, so we have 2 models, and then what we do is we analyze mathematically and ask, does this system give us lower prices for consumers? And does this give more incentives for consumers to implement energy conservation? And the analytical conclusions were that, in fact, it would cost consumers just as much as emissions trading among power plants, but would be a lot more complicated. So you're getting nothing for forcing consumers to trade carbon except a more complicated system. There were no advantages, and there were actually disadvantages. So we wrote this model up. It took us 2 months to document it. It was submitted as testimony to the California Public Utilities Commission, and then their decision in January of 2008, their decision directly quoted our proof saying that there's no advantage to having consumers trade carbon. There are lots of disadvantages, so we should go with a simpler system, and that's what they adopted. So this was an example of a simple model and a proof making a difference in a policy debate. Sometimes, however, you need numbers, and that will lead me to my second example, which is having fun with models, big models, millions of variables that give you specific answers. So the problem here is, what transmission lines should we build now, and which ones should we wait on, given that we don't know what's going to happen to carbon prices, technology, and the economics in the future? You saw what happened to my floating nukes. You saw what happened to demand forecasts. We were really wrong in the past, and I can assure you that we're going to be really wrong today. It's just that we don't know how we're going to be wrong. So what should we do? When we build a new power line, it's $1 billion or $2 billion. We might be building it to nowhere and giving nobody any benefits. Should we wait? But if we wait, then we don't get the benefits that the line might provide us in the near future. So we might forego benefits in the near future if we wait. So that's the trade-off. We lower the chance of making a mistake if we wait, but we forego some benefits in the near term. Okay, so here's the challenge. We have a lot of changes coming. We're going to have 33% renewables, we hope, in California by 2020, but we don't know where it's going to come from. Is it geothermal? Is it photovoltaics on roof? Is it central station photovoltaics? Is it imported wind power? Is wind power in the state? Each of those have different implications for the grid. Are we going to have a lot of distributed generation or central generation from other sources? What's going to happen to demand? Is everybody going to buy Teslas? And we're going to have a lot of electric vehicles, or maybe not. Will that demand be controllable? And finally, policy. Are we ever going to have a West-wide carbon cap or not? Are we going to have more aggressive renewable portfolio standards or not? What's going to happen to nukes? For example, 2 years ago, we lost half of our nuclear capacity in California? Might we lose the other half? That'll make a big difference. So given all those uncertainty, which lines should we build now? That's the problem. So looking at the problem more carefully, there's several aspects of it we have to consider. One is that we can delay decisions. We can wait and see. We have both short-term variability in terms of the output from renewable power and demand going up and down, and we have long-run uncertainties. And finally, we have a bi-level structure. Maybe it's not true with Seattle City Light, but it's true in California, where one set of entities owns generation, another set of entities own transmission, and others still yet might own the distribution. And the problem is, those who are planning transmission cannot control where the future generation will be sited. All you can do is try to anticipate how generators and consumers will respond to where you build the transmission. That's called a bi-level problem. Okay, so the questions I'm interested in: what's the optimal strategy? What do we build now? Where do we build it? And where do we wait? What is the value of information? If we could get better forecasts of future demand, what is that worth in terms of will improve decisions and lower the probability of making a mistake? What's the cost of disregarding uncertainty and making decisions naively like we have in the past, where we plan to a single forecast? Is there really any harm to planning naively like that? Maybe we'll make pretty much the same decision. And finally, what's the option value? What's the value of the flexibility of a particular line? For example, one line might, and we actually saw this in the western US, there might be a line that doesn't look good in any particular scenario or policy, but because where it's located, it can allow you to reach in the future a renewable area here or there, even though the line is more expensive and is not really best for this place or that place. It's best when you consider them both at once, because like a shortstop, you don't put the shortstop by the third baseman or the second baseman because you don't know where the ball's going to be hit. You put the shortstop in the middle so you can go right or left. Or for those of you who aren't fans of American baseball, think of a football goalie. Okay? So the optimal position when you don't know the future is in the middle of the goal, not at one extreme or the other. You might make very different decisions when you consider flexibility. Deterministic planning can't answer that question, but stochastic models that consider the uncertainty, what might happen in the future, can. Okay, here's the structure of the model. I'm not going to show equations. Perhaps that's a mistake. And it's probably not a good idea to use the whiteboard, right? Okay. This is called a decision tree. You start over here, and time goes from left to right. And on the left, you're making choices now for what transmission will be in place in 2020. But you don't know what the future holds. But as you go through time, you make this, 2012, 2014, 2016. Then there's some uncertainties. Mother Nature throws the dice. Maybe demand will grow, or maybe it won't. And then after that point, let's say in 2020, you're now making some decisions about what the grid will look like in 2030. You can make decisions after that. We've seen that there was demand growth, and now we can adjust. We can say, oops, we built the wrong type of generation here, so demand really grew. Let's put in a lot more combustion turbines or something else. These are called here and now decisions. We've got to make the choices today without knowing what the future holds. And these are wait and see decisions. These are adjustments you can make. And what adjustments you can make depends on what you did in 2020. So, for example, if we don't build a line from California to Wyoming, now we're not going to build a lot of wind in Wyoming in 2020 and 25 because there's no way to bring that power to market. So what you do here constrains what you can do later. This winds up being formulated as a single optimization problem with a set of decision variables for today, and then sets of decision variables for the future, wait and see variables, one set for every scenario. So for example, if I have 10 different scenarios for the future, I'll have 10 different set of variables for the 2030s. So these models can get big. A deterministic model would have just one scenario and might have 100,000 variables. But if I have 10 scenarios, I need to copy those variables for each scenario. So I'll have, instead of 100,000 variables, I'll have 1,000,000 variables. And that's how these things blow up. OK, so here's an example from a cute little island where Daniel used to live called called Great Britain. And National Grid was considering 5 different transmission lines. So up in Scotland, they have a lot of wind and a lot of sheep. And from wind and maybe sheep, you can generate, I suppose you could ferment sheep shit and produce power. You could export power down to London. Hopefully you bleep that out. The problem is that there are a lot of transmission constraints between the north and the south. So National Grid said, let's build all of these lines that deliver all this power down to London down here. And that's about £2 billion worth of transmission. They wanted to build that all right away. So we asked, which of these would you build, given that there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen in the British power system over the next 20 years? What are those uncertainties? So we considered 6 different scenarios. And we considered different scenarios regarding fundamental drivers that really shape the economics of the system. For example, what's going to happen to demand growth? What's going to happen to the carbon price in Europe? Other things, for example, it might be impossible to install new wind turbines on land in Great Britain after the next 5 years, because people really care about the landscape there. They don't like these ugly towers being sprinkled all over the place. Now, I'm imagining Holland 500 years ago, and environmentalists then saying, those satanic-looking windmills are terrible. You shouldn't build those. And now, of course, that's part of being Dutch. So, people may get used to them. But for the moment, I think there's a realistic possibility that land-based wind power will prove impossible to get planning permission for, which means if you're going to do renewables, you'll have to do them offshore where it's more expensive. Okay? So those are scenarios. Under each of the 6 scenarios, we make a bunch of assumptions about what happens to technology costs, what happens to demand, and so forth. And what I'm asking is, are there any transmission lines we should build now that no matter what happens in the future, they look good? Or that, like the shortstop between third base and second base, are well positioned for you to move in either direction? So here's the optimal solution for now. If you consider all those scenarios at once, and this model had about 500,000 variables, these variables describe where you build stuff and how you operate it in each of approximately 500 hours per year, because sometimes the wind blows in Scotland, sometimes it blows in Wales. You have high demand, low demand. You have to look at all those combinations. And by the time you're through looking at all the combinations of demand and wind, you have all the variables for how you operate the nukes, et cetera. And then you have all the variables for the stuff you build. There's 500,000 variables. It's not in a spreadsheet, but you can solve this within about 10 to 15 minutes on a reasonable size laptop. So here are the things you should do now to have in place by 2020. Build a lot of wind in Scotland. I don't see any sheep crap fermentation plants up there. Only build 2 out of the 5 lines. These are called the bootstraps. These are offshore lines to bypass Hadrian's Wall, which is the wall the Romans built between Scotland and England. The Romans were wise to try to keep the Scots out. Didn't work too well. Okay, and then a lot of wind in the west here. Even though this wind is less attractive, it blows at different times than the really good wind up here, so you need a mix of it, and the model captures that. A bunch of biomass plants and some new nukes. And then some gas-related plants. So the fun thing is that uncertainty meant that it's worth delaying. We should wait and see before we build the 3rd line here, or the 2 lines from Wales, or for the Midlands there. Okay, given that it's almost 10 after, I'm just going to quickly say that if you do deterministic planning, you get different results and you spend more money in expectation. Let's just split this. Let's skip this, sorry. Let's go to a more familiar area. Now, Daniel may disagree, but the network in the UK is basically, or at least at the highest voltage level, a radial system. It's basically Scotland to London. So that's pretty simple to plan. But here's the western US. It's a little bit more complicated. And this is a system that has 240 zones, about 140 generators, 500 transmission lines. So let's apply the same method to that. And as you can see, there's lots of good places for solar in red and lots of good places for wind in blue here. There's even some good places up here in Washington State. And so the question is, which of these corridors should we reinforce with new lines now? And which big interconnectors should we build to renewable resource areas? Which one should we build now, and which one should we wait and see? Same problem. And I'm just going to say that this problem, because it's not a cute little island, it's the Western North America, is much bigger, 1 to 2 million variables, and so we use a Bender's decomposition approach to solve the biggest versions of that. And basically what that involves is a master problem where you choose the design variables, where the lines are, where the power plants are, and then sub-problems where you operate the system. And there's a procedure, Bender's decomposition, where you can iterate between the two until you converge. That's in theory. In practice, this takes a long time to converge. So if you're interested, if you're a decomposition freak, come talk to me afterwards. And I'll talk to you about some neat tricks we came up with to make this converge a lot more quickly so that it's practical to solve a problem like the Western US on your laptop computer. Okay, so we call that an enhanced Bender's decomposition. And basically, this shows what you're doing. You're iterating between the design problem and the operating problem. Tentative design, what does it really cost to operate? Modify the design back and forth. It takes a long time to converge under the vanilla Bender's decomposition, but with the enhanced Bender's decomposition, you get a much better solution to begin with, and it converges much more quickly. So it actually becomes a practical thing to use. And we're hoping to actually work with the WECC over the next 2 years to implement this. Okay, so to conclude, sometimes you need insight. I have a public hearing on Friday in California on some aspects of power market design to incorporate renewables. We need to make conclusions quickly, within 2 weeks or a month, and we need to make a convincing argument. I can't wait for somebody's PhD dissertation to be done. I can't wait 5 years. So I use simple models to sometimes show that maybe a proposed solution has some problems, or maybe a proposed solution has some potential advantages, and it's a way to tell a story in a way that people can verify it. They can go through my proof. To do a good job of simple modeling, you should take economics. So you should leave this building, go over to the econ department and take econ. Sometimes, though, you need solutions that you're really implementing. You're going to really build lines. You're going to really operate power plants. These are large, often non-convex optimization problems. And what we would like to do in terms of these problems will always be bigger than what our computers will allow us to do. So there will always be challenges in terms of deciding what to simplify, how to make it more efficient. And finally, why this is fun is because power will not shrink importance. It will only become more important in the future. We want to keep power prices low. They're really low here in Seattle. Plus, we want to make the system sustainable. We don't want sea levels rising by 3 meters or more. We want to incorporate a lot more renewables. For example, Germany wants to go to 85 to 100% renewables by 2050. To do so and to keep the lights on and do this economic means we have to be a lot smarter about how we operate the system and how we plan the system. And uncertainty is reality, and the fact that you need to plan for a system where generators are acting independently, you need to anticipate what they're going to do. That makes your problems much more complicated. So there are lots of really interesting research problems here. And so maybe I even used the same closing line 20 years ago, Rich, you might remember. I close it saying, go forth and have fun. And I'm really grateful for you sitting through this talk. Rich, you'll remember, was it like 5 or 10 students we had 20 years ago? And we asked if there were any questions, and there were no questions. Let's see if we have any more questions now. Thanks very much.
So who wants to ask the first question?
So as I understand, you're trying to design a system within a system. There's people making power and people using power, and then somewhere in between you're dealing with the transmission and some of the people making it. And it would seem that if you design around the whole thing, we're going to have so much production, we're going to have so much utilization, you're in control of the whole thing. Then it becomes a nice simple convex problem and easy to optimize.
Right.
Okay? Now, so the question is, why don't you get into the business of, well, we don't have enough power utilization for our system, we're going to make an aluminum plant. Or we didn't have enough renewable power over in Wyoming, we're going to put up some windmills as part of the single economic entity that you're doing this with, in which case the optimal thing becomes simple. Am I missing something here?
So the question was, is this not a system with, there are several systems within this system, and if you had an overview of the entire system, could model the entire system, wouldn't that tell you what the best thing is to do, and why don't you just implement that?
Private industry, you know, if they want to build windmills, fine, please build windmills, but if you don't, we're going to build them. And if you want to build a power plant, fine, but if you don't, we're going to build them.
So, so that's actually a really good question. So the question is, why doesn't some central authority provide the backstop? You know, that we hope that the market will come through with the best investments in terms of supply, transmission, and consumption. But if the private market doesn't do that, then somebody will say, we'll step in and guarantee that there'll be still the supply and the demand that you need. So that's a delicate balance that we strike in market design. We realize that if we're too aggressive in doing that, if we're saying, you know, if they don't build, we're going to step in right away and build stuff, then the private sector might say, gee, if they're going to step in and build stuff, they might really tank the price, and it's less likely that I'll make a profit. So the threat or the promise of a backstop may actually chill private investment. So it's been argued that we shouldn't guarantee that there will be this backstop in order to ensure that people come forward, because otherwise, if we say that we'll provide the backstop, then for sure we're going to need it. That's one assertion.
And there could be negotiation like this, but right now you may be following the news about they passed laws to give Boeing some tax breaks to bring them in, and now they're negotiating with the machinists and so on. And it'll be the same kind of thing. Private industry is going to want some guarantees if they're going to step into this, and you probably have to give it to them. But what do you do if they don't? If nobody's stepping up, and you're running. You're talking about all these risks you're running, and there's no need for it. It doesn't seem like that. You know, nobody wants to step up, central authority, and say we're going to do this. It's a job for you know, national governments and so on.
So this is going to be so the issue of how much to promise in terms of being backing up and the willingness to step in if the private market doesn't perform is, I think, a question that's always going to be with us as long as we're not going to have central planning for the entire economy. I think that means that we're out of time.
Are there any more questions?
Yeah, there was a question in the back row.
Yeah, can you comment more? I think at the end you were just starting to talk about the difference between economics. If you like economics, you should focus on small models. If you like compact optimization, you should focus on large models. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you talk about kind of what kinds of problems and what kinds of technical skills and the trade-off between them? So, like, should people who want to work in this area focus a lot on economics, or they should focus on optimization, and kind of what's the balance, and do you need people who know both, and stuff like that?
So what skills are useful for people who want to have fun, who want to do modeling, given that there's more than one type of modeling? I think there are overlapping skills that are useful in both. So for example, the economics that are really useful in formulating and interpreting simple models, that economic intuition is also useful for interpreting the solutions from very complicated models. You look at these numbers and you say, well, what's the model trying to tell me? Telling the CEO, well, the model said so, and this is what we should do, is never convincing for making $1 billion investment. So I think economics is useful for both. I think optimization, even large-scale optimization, is useful for both, for simple models and larger models, because in large-scale optimization, when you're learning things like, you're learning about the dual, you're learning about decomposition, a lot of these things have notions, for example, decomposition, have strong ties to market decision processes. For example, decomposition can involve sending prices from a coordinating authority to sub-problems, and it looks just like a market. So now, if you have to choose between taking one more optimization course and one more economics course, I'm not sure what the right balance is, but I think that you should definitely have both of those in your quiver. Economics, especially resource and environmental economics, practical benefit cost analysis, optimization, both theory in interpreting and formulating these things, but also a lot of practice banging your head against realistic problems. So you have the confidence to go out and confront a new problem and be able to formulate it and solve it. And I hope this is not going to lengthen, how long it takes for you to get your PhD. But how many, just see a show of hands, how many people here have taken any economics in their graduate program? So 10 or 15%, which is 10 or 15% more than 20 years ago. All right, Rich? Okay.
Okay. One more question.
Russ.
So a lot of interesting tools that we have available to us in economics and optimization. Lots of problems that we see evolving in society with the issues of the power industry changing in the last 10 years. And as we look forward, lots of new challenges for the industry, giving opportunities to apply those skills to do useful things. What would you say are some of the most interesting and important questions that you would like to see addressed by bright students that are trying to make an impact?
So the question was, what sort of problems do I think that students would have most fun and perhaps career prospects working on? So what sort of, so for example, what might be good problems for your dissertation, or what might be good problems to work on in your first job? So on the modeling side, I think the things that we do very poorly in planning, we don't handle variability very well, especially correlations between variable renewables and load over space. We don't handle long-term uncertainties very well, especially quantifying the economic value of flexibility, of placing the shortstop between second and third, where exactly they should go. I don't think we do as good a job as we should in representing distributed resources, demand response, distributed storage, distributed generation in these models. We don't also understand very well of what's the best way to provide economic incentives so that we get what in the long run is the most economic and sustainable mix of distributed and central resources. I think we do a bad job in terms of the modeling and the technical side, and not a terribly good job of designing economic institutions. I think we're also, so the other area that I think is going to continue and be of even more importance in the future are those developing those technologies and integrating those that will lower our carbon footprint. So we don't have a national policy of carbon right now, but my guess is it's going to be increasingly evident whether through sea level rise, melting of the poles, more extreme weather events, that we need to deal with the carbon problem and do something quickly. So that means on the technology side, we need storage to integrate renewables and to make them more effective in lowering emissions. And we're going to need carbon capture and storage, and we need to figure out a way to do that in a way that is going to be less costly in terms of capital investment, more flexible in terms of how we operate power plants. So those are the 4 things that I would think: capturing variability, long-term uncertainties, distributed resources, and finally, technologies to integrate renewables and to lower carbon emissions that I think are really important for the near future and the far future.
Right. Well, let's thank again Ben Hobbs.
You're welcome.